and there was a projector set up, and you were like, yes! So this is the day when there's going to be a projector. We're going to just look at pictures of buildings and churches tonight and talk. Before we do a couple of housekeeping things, I'm excited that all of you are here. And talking, there was a thing when I first got out of seminary, I was ordained in a Christian Reformed church. And back in those days, you had the Christian Reformed church would have 2 services on Sunday. You had the morning service and the evening service, and they were 2 different services, like with different sermons and everything else. So it wasn't just the same one. You had to, you had to come back, and always like a fewer number of people came to the evening one, and you could tell if the pastor was a chicken, because he would give sermons about Sunday night attendance to the Sunday night people, which is kind of like preaching to the choir, right? It's like, those are the people who are here. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because you all are here, and I want to make sure all of y'all are here next week, and anybody who's listening be here, because next week we have some guest speakers. We have the 2 architects from Progressive AE, the church architects are doing all of the Catholic Church projects in the Diocese of Grand Rapids, and they're going to be here and talk about what canon law requires of how a church is set up and designed, because you can't just build whatever you want willy-nilly. And talk about that and the kinds of things that they're doing in churches. And John and Jamie, and I really hope that we have a good turnout for them. So it's, make us look good, that we fill the room. Okay? And then the following week, so 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to go on a field trip with John and Jamie, and we're going to go to 2 churches in the Diocese of Grand Rapids and see what they're doing, how they're working on renovating Catholic churches, and they're going to talk through what they're doing and why, and what the logic of it all is. And I think that's going to be pretty exciting. We're going to go to St. Robert's in Ada, and we're going to go to St. Mary Magdalene in Kentwood or Wyoming. Okay?
Are we going to do carpool?
Just carpool, yeah, we'll just meet there. And we can all caravan from here, or depending on where you're coming from, if you just want to meet us at St. Robert's, but we'll have explicit directions, everything's good. Okay? All right, and 2 other quick housekeeping matters before we get started. The first is we are in the midst of this 54-day rosary novena, pray, fight like heaven. Right? Some of you, hopefully everybody's heard it. And if you listen to the podcast, I interviewed the priest who launched it. And when he and I were talking about it, he said, there's going to be days when people will pray the full rosary, and days where, because of their day, they just couldn't get to it. And if you can only pray a decade, just pray a decade. So what I thought is, at least while this is going on, what we're going to do to open our class, we're going to pray a decade, and we're going to pray a decade for life. And fight like heaven and pray for the unborn and proposition 3. So will you pray a decade of the rosary with me? And that'll be our opening prayer for tonight. And also, as you do, in a more serious note, I got a text message about 2 or 3 hours ago that a friend of mine took his life yesterday. And obviously it's very grave matter, leaves behind a family. It's my age, and very tragic situation. I don't want to say his name, he is local, but if you can just pray for my friend and for the repose of his soul and for his family that are devastated by obviously the situation. Okay, so let's pray 1 decade of the rosary open class tonight for to fight like heaven against proposition 3 and for life. Okay, so in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.
Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, without end. Amen.
O my
Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven, especially those most in need of thy mercy.
Amen. In the Father, Son, and Spirit.
Hey, Craig, before you start.
Yeah.
Can I ask? I know in the Catholic Church, we have followed certain protocols that are designed. But what about the Protestant churches? Can they just go willy-nilly any which way they want? or-
That's an interesting, oh, you mean from an architecture standpoint?
Yeah,
That's a great question. It certainly depends on the denomination of Protestant. So that's a great question, actually. So one of the things, in a sense, there is no such thing as Protestant or Protestant theology. There's simply a lot of denominations that are not Catholic, right? And so there's a huge difference between the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Presbyterians and the Pentecostals and so on and so forth. So there's not necessarily a consistency among them all. So if you look at, say, the Church of England, or certain high church Lutherans, their architecture looks very similar to Catholic architecture. Anybody see any of the Queen's funeral today? Okay, so that is an Anglican cathedral, all right, Church of England. Looks very similar to a Roman Catholic church. Many of those were Roman Catholic churches until, the King of England took them over. But so Anglican churches and high Lutheran churches look very similar. And then if you look at a Calvinist church, it looks very, very, very different. One of the first ways you can tell you're in a Catholic church is when you walk in, what's at the front, right, in the center of the front, all right? So what's front and center in every Catholic church? The altar. But if you walk into most Protestant churches, particularly any church of the Presbyterian or Reformed thing, what you have in the center is the pulpit. Okay.
Yeah.
And here's the way I like to describe it. I'd say in all churches, all Christian churches, there are three things that happen. Okay. There's a sacrament, and there's sermons, and there's singing. Okay, three S's. Okay, singing, sacraments, and sermons. The issue is in the Catholic Church, the sacrament is front and center, and the sermon is off to the side. That's why the ambo is over there. It's not part of the sanctuary. Okay? When the Reformation came, they flipped it, and they made the sermon the center. The reading and the preaching of God's word was centered. And so what you see is the pulpit in the middle, and then you see the table, the communion table, it's called, the table of remembrance, usually like a wooden table that says remember on it or something like that. And that's shoved off to the side, kind of like the ambo is in a Catholic church. So they inverted, flip-flopped the word and the sacrament. And but then fast forward to like 20th century or to contemporary evangelicalism, the singing has moved to the center. So if you walk into the kind of evangelical megachurches that I used to be a part of for a while and help work for some architecture firms to help get those things going, what you get is when you walk in, it's just a bare stage with a big screen, and what's in the middle is the praise team. So people with microphones or headsets, and there's a band and there's drums and they're singing and it's saying, and then there's no table. There's no communion table at all. If they do communion once a quarter or once a year, they'll come out and have some kind of a little, bread thing or juice thing set up, but there's no permanent recognition of it. And then there's no pulpit either. So what happens is the pastor, the music pastor, the teaching pastor walks out after a half hour of singing, and he's got a headset mic on, and he just stands there and talks while there's a giant, screen of him, behind him. And maybe he has a music stand or something that goes notes on. So really, it's the singing, the sermon, the sacrament. And it's about where you place those, and where you place those really becomes determinative of how you design around them. Right? Does that make sense?
Most of the Episcopal, Presbyterian, Third Reformed
Right.
are like ours, though, altar in the center, pulpit to the side. Yes, I go to them.
Well, they wouldn't have an altar. They would have a communion table that's down below, but it's not a consecrated altar. Reformed
May not
church.
be consecrated, but it's in the same place.
Yeah.
as ours is.
In the center.
So, good question. All right. Shall we look at some buildings? In fact, let's talk about this.
My wife had a question.
Yeah. Go
Are
ahead.
there any non-Catholic basilicas?
No, not well. Technically, if what you mean by a basilica,
Basilica is a form of construction.
yeah, there's two things. Number one, the basilica first meant an architectural form. So it was a particular style of Roman imperial building that was usually used as some kind of a town hall. So it's a basilica in every city. It had, strict kind of architectural designs, and it was always like the civic center. That was where you went to pay your taxes, or that's where the magistrate was to hear court cases or lawsuits or any of these kinds of things. You go to the basilica. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the basilica construction was utilized as a standard form for churches in the basilica era. So you can see basilica churches like St. John Lateran is a good example of a basilica style church, and some of the other seven pilgrim churches in Rome are perfect, Roman basilicas, and in many cases they were converted like Lateran, like the Laterana was. However, that term gets used in another way. So over time, over hundreds, thousands of years, the term basilica also became a term of not just an architectural style, it also became a way to signify that a church was important. So you have basilicas, and so there are four major basilicas in the world, four major papal basilicas on the whole planet. Okay? They are St. Peter's Basilica, St. John Lateran, St. Paul outside the walls where Paul is buried, and St. Mary Major up on the Esquiline Hill in Rome. And then there are a lot of minor basilicas. So we have one in Grand Rapids here. I'm saying Adelphos or Adelphos.
Yeah.
And what those are the term basilica has been used to designate them as a significant or important either because something important happened there, or it's a particularly beautiful or architecturally beautiful church, and they're given the title basilica, and they get to use the title basilica. There's a little like a thing that looks like an umbrella. It's like a little multicolored umbrella that hangs up near the front of the church, and that means that it's been given the title basilica. So how many of you went with us on the field trip to Detroit last time? Okay, so the Shrine of the Little Flower, the Shrine of the Little Flower was the Shrine of the Little Flower since the 1930s, but it was like 3-4 years ago, it also got the title basilica. So the Vatican said it's such an architecturally important church that we're going to title it. So now it's the Basilica Shrine of the Little Flower. So a term that in one context means an architectural style also is used now to designate an important church. Now, to the sense, are there non-Catholic basilicas? Well, you can certainly find non-Catholic buildings that are built in that architectural style. And but in the sense of it being one that has been designated by the Vatican as a particularly remarkable Catholic church, then that would be a title given by the Vatican to Catholic churches.
I did a tour several years back of St. Adalbert's, and one of the things that they said why you have a basilica is if the Pope were to visit, that is where he would come and say his mass.
Yeah,
What's
they're
the umbrellas for it?
yeah, they're designated by the Pope, and there's a whole process where I imagine dioceses and bishops, probably petition the Vatican to designate important churches as basilicas. We're going to actually see some pictures of them, so let's get into that. Okay, let's talk about the parts of the Catholic Church, just what we were talking about right now. So a little bit of a review, or maybe not. So this would be, a basilica church in the sense of the architectural style of how basilicas were designed. And you would have in that old Roman architectural style, there's actually a rule. The basilica would be, the proportions were, the width of it would be 1/3 to 1/2 the length. So you see it's a rectangle. And you would have an area out here called the porch, because it's like a flat spot out. People would come up. If you've ever been to a lot of these kinds of churches, there literally is steps up in a kind of a porch area. And again, that's very Roman. Then you come into this, there's a facade, which would be that front side of the building. And when you look at a lot of the old basilicas, they got this big facade added to them. So St. John Lateran, for example, when you stand out there, has all these amazing carvings on the front. But before that, it was just kind of flat. And then they stick that on. There's a facade. And like, for example, if you go to Grand Rapids and you look at our cathedral in Grand Rapids, it's got a beautiful facade, right? So that facade is really important. And well, Amy, you were in Maryland. So one of my favorite churches on the whole planet is the Cathedral, the Duomo in Orvieto, Italy, when we went there. And the whole front of the facade is carved with like the entire biblical story. There's actually these carvings you see from like God creating the world in 6 days to like the Last Judgment. And it's just the whole entire front of the church is covered with these beautiful things in the facade. Then, typically you have a bell tower, okay, or two, depending on the church. Then the narthex. And the narthex goes back to those Roman days when this was a government building, okay? And the narthex was basically the waiting area, the preparation. The word in Latin means something like preparation or preparatory. So you go into the narthex to prepare to be called in for your court case or whatever. So you prepare yourself. And that's why when these became churches, the narthex took on a significance. Why? In the narthex, it's the place we prepare ourselves, sort of spiritually and emotionally ready ourselves to enter into the church. Make sense? It's not just a law. It's not just a gathering space. It's a time of preparation. Then when you come in, you'll have the nave, which is the main seating aisle down the middle. And yes, that comes from the term that's rooted in the original language of naval. It's from the same place we get naval, boat, because this is the ship of St. Peter. And we are in the ship of St. Peter, all the people sitting in the seats. Then the side aisles, typically you have a line of columns. We'll see some more pictures here in a little bit. And the columns along here create a side aisle. So, you go or even to Grand Rapids to our cathedral, you'll see the main nave, and there'll be these columns, and then there's this kind of aisles down the side. And we'll maybe see some churches here that sometimes have a double aisle system, like St. Peter's does. Then a lot of times you'll have a chapel that sits off the main, or many chapels. Some of the grand churches have multiple, 2 or 3 or 4 chapels along each side. And this is instrumental to, as we talk about John and Jamie coming next week, about where Our Lady of Lake can't put the tabernacle. Okay, so when we first inquired to the bishop's office, they said technically OLL's tabernacle is not in compliance with canon law where it sits now. Okay. So if you go to the canon law, the Roman Missal promulgated by Vatican II, okay, and that's what John and Jamie talk about next week. The tabernacle, if it's not in the front of the church, needs to be in a place organically connected to the nave and visible from the faithful while they're sitting. So, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, the tabernacle is not up front, it's in a side aisle, about halfway down, side chapel. There's a big side chapel. That is legitimate, but putting it in another part of the building that's not connected is not. So that whole thing about the chapel, and if you go and look at some of the great churches, you'll see 2 or 3 different kinds of side chapels dedicated to saints or whatnot. I think St. Peter's has like 3 or 4 along each side as you go down. Then you come to this thing called the transept. Transept, that's because when you look at it from the top, it makes a cross, right? So here's the long part of the cross, and then there's this part. And this little transept, right, forms it as a cross. Now, you actually literally call them the left transept and the right transept. And there's this old thing sometimes where you'll see where the left side is the Gospels transept, and the right side is the Epistles transept, like in certain kind of old schemes. But a lot of times you'll see some churches where the tabernacle will be located in one of the transepts. So if you go to St. John Lateran, but also when we were at the cathedral in Detroit, it's in the right transept. Okay. Then I wish I had a pokey stick. Right where the word transept is, where those two intersect, right? Sometimes in certain churches the altar will be put there, because if you think about it, if Jesus, right, the altar would be here, and what happens on the altar? The sacrifice of his blood, right over, in a sense, what represents his heart. Then this area behind it sometimes is shallow like this, and sometimes it's really deep. Okay? The word presbytery, anybody know what that refers to? Presbyterians? There's no Presbyterians in this church. The Greek word presbyter means elder or priest. Okay? Yeah, well, it's actually one of the offices. So there are 3 offices that are designated by Paul, St. Paul in the New Testament. And the Greek words are the episkopoi, the presbytoi, and the diakonoi. Okay? And Protestants, Presbyterians, interpret presbyterians elders or pastors. Obviously, we interpret them as priests, but the reason that's called the presbytery is that's kind of like the sacred area back there where the various priests and deacons and whatnot are. And sometimes that gets real deep, and there's seats back there for the choir, and sometimes that's called the choir. This area where it says presbytery, sometimes that extends back quite a way. So you'll see like seats on the side, whatnot. And then you have this curvy thing at the end. Now, in a Roman basilica, pre-Christianity, when it was the building used for court cases and the city magistrate was in there, where do you think the magistrate sat to judge cases and hear lawsuits and all that? in
Yeah,
the Alps, right? So, right, and if you're like, the head cheese, the big enchilada, right? Where are you gonna sit? You're gonna sit on a chair in the back, and make people walk down the long aisle to you, right? Place of authority. And so that's where that apse gets carried into Catholic churches, and a lot of different things you'll see done in apses. In some cases, like at St. John Lateran, that's where the bishop's chair is. In some cases, you have a tabernacle if they choose to put it there. In some cases, often you have a reredos, which is like a screen, a painted screen or carved screen with saints on it. And in many cases, especially in the older churches, the apse is a curved space where beautiful murals are painted. Okay, so you'll see murals of the apostles or whatnot. So those are kind of some basic parts of a church. Now, there is a logic to it. Actually, architects like to talk about story and narrative. So listen, because John and Jamie next week will inevitably use the word narrative or story, because architects love to talk about narrative. I work with a lot of architects for a lot of years. They love narrative and story. So what they'll say is that a building should tell you a story, it should be a narrative. Okay. I remember last week when we talked about the tabernacle and the temple and how there was like the court of the Gentiles and then the holy place and the holy place. Well, there's a narrative here. And again, I wish I had a pokey stick, but okay, so look at this old design of a church, all right? And this would be the outside area is called the porch, right? And the narthex. But now look at how this mirrors kind of the temple, but more than just mirroring the temple, it mirrors the story, spiritual narrative. So out here, the forecourt is life without grace. This is the court of the Gentiles, right? As you enter the church, you are coming from not being with God, coming deeper in and approaching. So then as you go further into the nave, like this would be the forecourt. We don't, actually, I didn't show you that before. A lot of the old Roman churches had like a courtyard area here where the porch is. So then, I don't have my pokey stick, but up there, you would enter the nave. So just think about the narrative. I don't know Christ. I'm lost in the world, right? For the Gentiles. As I enter through the narthex into the nave, I enter into what? The people of God. All right? And that's the road to salvation. So you said BC, this is before Christ, AD after Christ. And as I approach the altar, I'm representing that I'm moving through purgatory toward heaven and sanctuary. Okay, does that make sense? That in a sense, as you enter the church, it should be a representation of the spiritual journey. Now, based on this, I mean, I'm lobbing a softball here, like, gotta be able to hit this one. Based on that, where do most Catholic churches traditionally put the baptismal?
Some have it in the back and some have it in the front. A lot of them have it in the back.
In the entrance.
The traditional location is at the back as you pass from the narthex into the nave. So think about the cathedral in Grand Rapids. When you come in, right, there's the font right there, and as you come out of the narthex, you pass the baptismal font into the nave. Why? How do we enter into the church? We enter the church through baptism, right? And so that's telling that narrative, that story. And when we leave the church, we're reminded as we go out that our baptism initiates us in the faith. Does that make sense? And so the traditional location in Catholic churches, this is a poor excuse for a pokey stick, is that back of the nave, the transition area from the narthex to the nave, because it has spiritual significance in that spot. Questions on that? Comments?
newer ones seem to have it up front.
There are some, like the rule, like this isn't a hard and fast rule, but when we're talking about 2,000 years of tradition and how churches have traditionally been built, most of the time they're located in church architecture at the back of the nave, between the nave and the narthex, for that reason. And in fact, if you go to those kinds of churches, right, what happens is, like, we have holy water, here by the lake, but typically where you will, dip your hand in the holy water is as you go past the baptismal, right there. So I was just down on Friday at St. Peter's in Douglas to see, now it's all done, they completely renovated it. And they moved the baptismal font to the back. And I have a
And all of those things at one time during building plans all get to be very political. And as I sit here and listen, I've been part of both building programs, the original one here and the second one. Just about all of these things were very political. And the baptismal font was a huge one.
lots of opinions.
It's a huge one. And I've seen meetings where the priest was called names, people threatened to leave through things. That's how you
Yep.
that's how you get a church that doesn't resemble a church.
Yep. So St. Peter's at Douglas, I took this picture the other day. This is from back at the narthex entering into the nave, how they did this baptismal. Well, you can see that there's a little basin up there, holy water, and it trickles down like a little trickly water feature into there, keeps cycling. So yeah, that's a traditional location for it. So any other questions about the basic parts or layouts of the Catholic Church? And then I'm going to show you some examples. Yeah.
They have in the previous picture where you showed the chapel off to the side, is it an actual room or is it just?
Like an alcove.
Yeah.
Depends on the church. And some of them, St. Peter's, St. Mary Major, remember we went in there, and a lot of them, it's like a full room, like a big chapel room with 50 seats in it. Like if you go into those churches, like again, just St. Peter's one that most people are familiar with, is the most famous church in the world. But when you go in there, and then the tabernacle is in there, and there's, I don't know, 10 rows of benches and whatever, and people are in there, praying and doing adoration.
St. Robert's used to have their, in the room that they had their masses.
Yeah. And see, one of the things that's complicated is because we have a round room, where do you put that?
Yeah.
Because there's no place that you can put us in a side chapel that people don't have their back to it. And we were told that at the bishop's office, the people can't sit with their back to the tabernacle, like behind them. So it does.
Those side chapels, most of the time, I think that I saw, were totally open. There's no wall there and door. They were visible from the.
It depends. Yeah, most of the time, often it's like sometimes there's like an alcove, that you step into. Sometimes it's a full-on, kind of room that you go into. Typically, when it's they'll outside a door or a curtain, a drapery. A lot of times.
Because St. Francis has a
You can have mass in them.
Oh yes.
St. John the 23rd in the Basilica.
Oh yeah, they do. It's
Yes, they do. I was there.
Yeah. For example, a lot of the really big basilicas, St. Peter's, those kinds of places. It's so big they don't have like a full mass in the nave all the time because it's very rare that they can fit everybody in there. Like I've been to a number of masses in St. Peter's in Rome in the transept. So they typically in the left transept they have mass in there, like in St. Peter's, like 4 times a day, like 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. And so there's always like every couple of hours there's a mass going on usually in the left transept. But the left transept at St. Peter's is like the size of our Father Nash Hall. It's just massive, right? You can see 200 people in there. Because the whole room, like if you fill the nave, they can rarely fill that. So yeah, sometimes you have masses in the side chapels and those, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing. I mean, our chapel is just disconnected from the space, but typically, yeah, that's where you have a daily mass. And then, in fact, just since we're on that, like in St. Peter's, a lot of times there's all these other altars. I think there's like it's a crazy number. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of altars. Like, I mean, some like 4 dozen or 6 dozen or I don't know, whatever, dozen altars in St. Peter's of all different types through there. And people are always offering masses or private masses or whatever. And there was one that's like about halfway down the aisle, one of the aisles, and there's like and it's crazy, like you go in there and they'll be like in these big columns, there'll be just kind of a little area for a mass and an altar. And one of them, remember the one we went to, Pope John the 23rd was actually entombed right there. Yeah, and you know, you did the little mass right, in front of him. So yeah, it just depends on the building and the space and how they do it. So, okay, so let's get into just, there's like the evolution of architecture. Like I find this stuff endlessly fascinating, and maybe most people don't, but I just think buildings are beautiful and interesting, and how buildings have been built over time, that part is interesting. But I mean, I'm not going to give you a whole night of like intense whatever, but I want to just pick on two kind of architectural styles that are very dominant in Catholic churches, and we can see them here in Catholic churches in the United States, and that is the Romanesque architectural style. I had the first one I talked about. So after the end of the Basilica era, there was like a transition architecture just in terms of design and styles, and they began to move away from the sloped roofs of the old Basilica style, and they began to raise the roofs, do things differently. And this style became known as Romanesque, and for like 1,000 years, 700, 800 years, 1,000 years, Romanesque was the style of most of the Catholic Church had built here, right? Through the Middle Ages. And this would be an example of Romanesque church architecture. So you can see the building starts getting taller. It's no longer that basilica with the sloped roofs that looks like a pole barn. Now it's starting to have these towers, and it has these vaulted roofs, barrel vaults, rounded barrel vaults, vaulted roofs. You can see the cruciform pattern. A lot of times there's a second floor there, higher up. And then what you'll do is over the intersection of the transepts and the nave, center of the cross, you'll put a dome or a spire. Okay. Now, the thing with Romanesque architecture, you can always tell it from the next style because of, right? Who can tell me this? That the arches and the windows this is the total giveaway. In Romanesque architecture, the windows or the arches are round. Okay? They're rounded. And there's a reason. And they're relatively small. Okay? Romanesque windows and arches are relatively small, and there's a reason that a few of you in this room will find really fascinating, and most of you find super boring. And that has to do with engineering. How do you hold up the weight of the building? Because all that stuff up there is super heavy, and there's no girders, there's no steel superstructure. It's just gravity masonry. Right? I mean, it's just blocks stacked on top of blocks. It's the only thing holding it together. I mean, St. Peter's Basilica doesn't have any steel girders, and it's just held together with, gravity masonry, like basically big rocks stacked on top of other big rocks. That's it. But the thing is obviously the higher up you go, the heavier it gets, and it puts an enormous amount of weight on the walls down below. So when you punch holes in walls that are weight-bearing walls, if they get too many holes in them, they get too big, they fall down, right? Like you're playing Jenga, and they start collapsing. So what happened is the walls have to be relatively thick, okay? And the windows are small, and the round arch, going back to the time of the Romans, is a stable thing. Like, on those aqueducts and all that, it's engineeringly stable, if that's a word. Engineeringly, it's stable engineering, and it can bear the weight. But you can't have too many windows, and they have to be relatively small and rounded. All right, that's one dead giveaway. And so there's not much light in them. They're beautiful churches, absolutely beautiful churches. Here's some examples. Again, here's all the round windows and arches, and you'll see these. I think this is in Iowa. I just had grabbed examples of Romanesque church architecture off the internet. But you'll see these kinds of churches, Catholic churches, all in every city in America, something with this kind of style, right? Haven't you? I mean, this architecture has a Romanesque architecture. See the rounded windows, relatively small compared to the space. Anybody we don't have any, I don't have any treats or anything to give away. Anybody want to know what this old big window in the front of a building like this is called?
Rooster.
The rose window. Yeah.
Mhm.
Let's light it. But you can see this is like, that's just a parish church in Iowa, but there's ones in Grand Rapids like this and all around. That's that traditional Romanesque architecture, okay? Then you have the Gothic architecture, okay? Now, the Gothic architecture becomes really popular around 1200, let's say. And the Gothic was a term that they came up with later, a couple hundred years later. This guy named George Vasari writes this book about architecture, and he doesn't like Gothic architecture, so he wants to come up with a disparaging name for it. He calls it Gothic, because the Gothic where people live, the Goths, like the Goths invaded Northern Europe, and it's like that ugly stuff, from the Gothic parts of Europe. But during the day, when it was popular, it was called the French style. It was called just churches in the French style. And Northern France. And so you can see some very famous examples, like in France, like Notre Dame de Paris, and some of the other like remarkable one Saint-Denis and some of those in France. And here's the deal. Again, I'm not going to bore anybody too much with the engineering part of it. But here's the thing. Remember that big Romanesque building? It's beautiful, but it's got small windows. It's kind of dark because you have to hold the building up, right? So some bright guy in France came up with the idea that it would be sure cool if we could let a lot more light in here. But in order to let more light in here and break the walls, we had to build these kinds of struts, okay? And these struts, these buttresses and struts, would bear the weight. And then you could take out all the masonry between them and fill them with windows. So this is actually Notre Dame de Paris, right in France, Paris, France, right on the island. But you start to see, first of all, they get pointy. So, right, Romanesque was rounded. These have pointy arches and pointy windows, okay? Because they don't have to bear weight. They're designed to be, they're pointy because they're not weight bearing. The weight is all borne by this system of trusses and buttresses. And all of these gaps in between them, you can fill them with stained glass windows, because the weight is being held up by this structure, the superstructure. So it's really interesting, I think it's interesting, when you see this thing being built, how they build it with these giant kind of buttresses and struts to hold the full thing up. Then you got all these gaps between it, and you start filling them in with pretty stained glass windows. And so you see kind of the nave, and you get this kind of just beautiful look. And what it does in the Gothic architecture, especially with these flying buttresses and whatnot, is it creates light and space. This is Notre Dame de Paris. And the kind of flying buttresses. And this is Saint-Denis in one of the most famous Gothic cathedrals in Paris. And you can see the rose window, but do you see how these struts up there are basically bearing the weight? In between these struts and buttresses, you can fill it with glass, and these are remarkable churches. It's full of light, just spaces of light, and it points you all up to God. It's remarkable, most beautiful thing ever built. Now, architecture over time, you end up having forms evolve and people tweak them and they do this and this. So you have like neo-Romanesque and Romanesque revival, and you have neo-Gothic, Gothic revival, where they start tweaking the elements. The important thing to know on that one is that neo-Gothic sheets. So there's a neo-Gothic church cathedral near us, which is the Cathedral of St. Andrew in Grand Rapids, which is neo-Gothic. And what that means is it looks Gothic, but they cheated and they used like beams and struts inside the walls. Right? It doesn't really have flying buttresses. So what they were doing is, by the time you were in the 20th century, early 20th century, you now had construction materials that weren't available in the 13th century. And so it was cheaper to put like some beams and stuff in there and create the look of a Gothic cathedral without actually the engineering of a Gothic cathedral. Isn't that interesting for those of you who love engineering? I love engineering. So my dad was an engineer, my family was an engineer. I think that's really cool. Questions about those architectural styles? Because you're going to see, and you'll see interesting blends of them. Again, if you go to the Cathedral of St. Andrew, when we were over in in Detroit, the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart over there is Gothic or Neo-Gothic. The Basilica Shrine of the Little Flower is basically have Romanesque elements. And you'll see everything in between until you hit, well, 50, 60 years ago, you started building modernist buildings that had no connection to the tradition. Right? And one of the things that is going on is this huge revival in the Catholic Church in America now architecturally to reclaim some of the tradition, and sometimes looking at these churches that were modernist buildings and going, well, you can't rebuild them, but there are ways that you can add or bring back or incorporate some elements that connect to the tradition.
When
So
was St. Andrew's built? Do you remember?
1913, right after World War I.
And when I was there, I looked it over closely, and I would guarantee that has a steel frame.
Yeah.
That is not load bearing.
No,
Yeah.
it's neo-Gothic.
No, it's a framed building. Yeah.
So about when did that fine buttress develop? Was it the
1200s.
1200s?
Yeah, 1200s, the height of the glorious Middle Ages. You know, Chartres Cathedral in northern France, and Saint Denis and Notre Dame de Paris, and that's where they exploded. You see some of those Gothic cathedrals also in England, and you see very few of them in Italy. Very few of them in Italy, and there's some reasons for that. Part of it is that a lot of the churches in Rome and central Italy got destroyed because of wars in the 1400s, 1500s, and by the time that they began to rebuild Rome, the Gothic era had passed, and they were onto something called Baroque style. So, like St. Peter's is Baroque, but that beautiful Gothic cathedral, there are a few of them with flying buttresses. When you go to Assisi, the Basilica of St. Clare on the hill is Santa Chiara is Gothic, whereas the Basilica of St. Francis is Romanesque. So you see an interesting blends of these things, but that neo-Gothic style is very popular. And I'm going to show you some examples of these around the United States, okay? So, yeah, please.
It occurs to me, so I'm going to ask you what you think, that this re-emphasis on the traditional way of building churches, is that some, do you suppose it might be related a little bit to realization of poor catechesis and returning to the emphasis, making sure people know their faith?
I think, yeah, I think that's a lot of it. I think that there is a sense in an awareness, a realization that we have drifted from our roots, and nobody's talking about me, but that we have drifted from the tradition. We have drifted from being connected, from being truly Catholic, which means living in continuity. I mean, obviously, nothing is frozen in time like a museum, but there's a sense of continuity over the ages, and that what happened in the last 50 years was there was a radical break with that, and our buildings, in a sense, the question is, your question about catechesis is a good one, which is, as I think about it, did poor catechesis lead to bad architecture? Or did bad architecture, in a sense, lead to poor catechesis because it disconnected us from our identity? And it's probably a little bit of both. I think that what happened is you had generations growing up in a church that was disconnected from the Catholic tradition, and in some sense, for a while in the 80s and the 90s was trying to disconnect itself from Catholic tradition. And I think there's a realization now when we look around, like in the Wednesday night class, we're talking about the Eucharist and how few Catholics believe in the Catholic doctrines of the Eucharist and this and that, that there's a realization that we have drifted too far away from our identity. And that's a word that gets used a lot, is how do we re-embrace, not how to necessarily go backwards. You can't turn the clock back and make it the 1200s again, but how do you embrace your Catholic, how do we embrace our Catholic identity and bring that into the 21st century? And so that's why people are asking these kinds of questions. Yeah.
One of the things that I can remember years ago, I think the second time we lived here, and the Blessed Sacrament was not in the church. And that's when I first noticed people were bowing to the altar because there was nothing. We always genuflected. I mean, and there's still, you'll see people who have that old idea that you genuflect, you know, to the altar or to the Blessed Sacrament. But now we have the Blessed Sacrament and an altar in the same room. And we're really supposed to be genuflecting to the Blessed Sacrament because that's more important than the altar. And I think that's one of those old traditions that you need to kind of bring back, or move the Blessed Sacrament.
Well, and you know, it's an old cliche to say that the cathedrals or the churches were sermons in stone, but they taught. You know, so that thing like the baptismal font, right? Where you say that teaches you something. Every time you walk into the building, it's reinforcing truths. And so when you disconnect a people, and we are a people, from our roots, our traditions, to be Catholic is to be universal, which means that we are connected not just to all people alive at this time, but to all Catholics over the 20 centuries before us. That we are one. It's what G.K. Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. He has this wonderful passage in Orthodoxy where he says, when it comes to deciding what's right, why should we only listen to the people who still happen to be walking around? Why wouldn't we listen to all of those who came before? Why don't they get a vote about truth? And he said that is the democracy of the dead, that our vote matters, but so does all the votes that came before us. And so, obviously you're not going to build Gothic cathedrals with flying buttresses with, gravity masonry, or, we're going to put steel frames in them, right? But those kinds of things, but we can look to the past to find the best elements that are worth preserving and bringing forward, utilizing also, contemporary materials and insights and all these kinds of things, right? So, it's a living thing. But your quick question is a good one about catechesis is what is the dynamic between what we know and what we believe in the environment and the liturgy? The liturgy that we celebrate, the environment that we celebrate it in, the sacred spaces we do, how much does our knowledge and belief inform that, and how much is our knowledge and belief informed by it? And I think, the reality is there's a dynamic there. Yeah, Dennis.
The Greek courses, some of you people may have heard of it,
Yeah,
where there's
love
a
those.
ton of different topics. And one of them is cathedrals.
Yeah.
And it's really from I guess about 1200 to 1500. All these cathedrals are up there, and how important you're talking about carvings of
The facades. Yeah.
those are all telling stories.
Oh yeah.
And those were built at the time when people did not have communication. So the stained glass windows, the sculptures, all of that dealt with teaching, if you will.
So the people who have gone to Italy with me, a couple in the room here, and others that I've gone with, are subjected to my endless rants about this, because when you go to like Orvieto Cathedral, my contention was that the people who came to mass in that cathedral in 1300 knew the Bible better than we do. They may not have been literate. They certainly didn't have it on their smartphone or in an audiobook format, we have more access to the Bible than they did, but they knew it better. Because when you walk into Orvieto and you look at the carvings on the facade, and you walk inside, the entire biblical stories are there. You could ask them, what about this Bible story? What about this one? And they were there. They were there around them. They lived they soaked in scripture and story and doctrine and truth. It was all around you. And when you walk into these sort of, and when I say brutalist, that's actually a term in architecture, these sort of brutalist, naked, modernist buildings, you walk in and you go, where's the liturgical art that tells stories?
When I was very young and then grew into adolescence and then got in the 20s and the 30s, I went in a new Catholic church. Two things I looked at to see how they were treated were, how are the stations arranged?
Yeah.
How about the St. Joseph side?
Yeah.
The treatment on the right side of the acts, and the St. Mary's side on the left side of the acts.
And now, do we even
Now,
have a St. Joseph
you
side?
come
or
to
St.
this
Mary's
church,
side?
there is no,
We have no St.
there is
Joseph
no
or St.
St.
Mary's
Mary.
side. No,
Like during the chapel, they're stuck to the side.
we put those in there a
Put
couple
them
years
there.
ago. We've got those little statues and stuck them up there, but they hadn't been there and they were not designed into the architecture. Right.
Mhm.
And the thing is that all of those things as moments of teaching. So I want to show you, dive into some of these pictures of the churches, because they're remarkable how much the space itself catechized. So first, let's talk about the oldest. I'm going to run through these real quick. Now, if you watched the American Pilgrimages series that we did last year in Lane, cool. If you didn't, please do, because I went through in several episodes the history of all of these original Catholic missions to the United States. But this is the first Catholic mission or church in the entire United States. It's in St. Augustine, Florida. Okay. And actually, there was a shrine there that was about 25 years before that, 30 years before that, late 1500s. Spanish came there, but the first one that they actually built as a church and is still functioning as a church is Our Lady of La Leche in St. Augustine, dating to 1609. Now, as I pointed out in American Pilgrims, that's before Jamestown, where the English talk about we came to Jamestown, blah, 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 you know, and I say to my Protestant friends, the Catholic Church was established in the United States before that. And it's this beautiful little mission style. I'm going to show you a couple of these mission styles. You can see elements in the mission style, Spanish mission style. See the rounded windows, the flat roof that almost looks like a narthex kind of a roof. So there's something, but you see the facade at the front. That's why you put that big thing up there. So some of these kinds of things, and also mission style churches that the Franciscans and whatnot built in these years were inexpensive. They were capable of being built by, they were in the New World with the Native Americans, and they had very limited materials. And these were things you could build out of adobe and mud and brick and whatnot. And this is the inside. It was recently, a number of years ago, I think this has been given basilica status recently. Down in St. Augustine. Yeah. See, those are called clerestory windows. And you see the beautiful art at the front. Bob was talking about the St. Joseph's Eyes, but you see the statuary, you see Our Lady, you see these kinds of elements that are just brought in to make it not only beautiful, but instructive. Probably the second one, a year later, meanwhile, over in New Mexico, if you watch the American Pilgrimages episode on that, we saw that the Spanish missionaries were coming up from Mexico into Arizona and Mexico and Texas. And this is the San Miguel Mission, Santa Fe. It is also still an operating parish church to this day.
Been there.
Yeah, wonderful. And you can see inside still some of those elements of those mission style churches, including that wall in the back with all the statues, which is called the Reredos. We have one in the Reredos. We have one in Grand Rapids. It's a screen that sits in the back, usually filled with images or statues of saints. But you can see even in this small mission space, the art that gets brought into it. And there's a close-up of the Beatus, and you can see various saints commemorated there, including, you can see at the top Saint Michael up there with the wings and the sword and the shield, as this is San Miguel's, Saint Michael's Spanish. Now, meanwhile, actually, it was quite a bit later. I did a whole episode on Junipero Serra and the California 21 missions that he put up the coast, and that was a fun episode to do. And this is the first one. This is base station in San Diego de Acala, and right there in San Diego. This was the first of Junipero Serra's missions, and there were 21 of them that go all the way up to San Francisco, just past San Francisco Bay. And we have talked about, I don't know if we will do, but we have considered if there would be sufficient interest in working with one of our tour companies, like Kilo 6 or whatever, to do a pilgrimage to the California missions of Junipero Serra up the California coast for a few days. We have to make sure we have enough people to make that work, but that's something. I have personally lived next to, or very close to 3 of them in my life. San Juan Capistrano, we used to go surfing in high school at Capistrano Beach, Cape Capo Beach, we used to call it. And then San Buenaventura, that's where we lived before we moved to home. And you can see again inside that mission style. Now, see the umbrella thing? That means it's a basilica, minor basilica. And then you can see the stations along the side, but you also see the altar, and then you can see up in the apse. And you can see the St. Joseph statue over on one side, the St. Joseph side, and St. Mary's side. And these were the elements. And the thing is, I'm not going to let you show you this one because actually a lot of them look the same way, the Junipero Serra missions, because basically they go up every year or two and build another one, the Franciscans. This is New Orleans. And if you've ever been there, this is a pretty grand looking building right there, but it dates all the way to 1789. And inside, and what kind of architectural style would this be? What shape are the windows?
Romanesque.
Romanesque. Yep. There was a barrel vault at the top. You can see where the nave, side aisles, and the apse down there with a large fresco in the apse. And one close to us that we did not get to when we went to Detroit because they were having a wedding that day. This place is super popular, like every Saturday for weddings. And we tried to stop here when we did our field trip, and they were like clocked out for a wedding that day. This is St. Andrew, Detroit. It is, depending on who you listen to, they argue, there's a couple people arguing about this, they're the oldest continually operating parish church in the United States. Because San Miguel says, well, yeah, but it kind of moved and stopped for a while and started up again. And Detroit are both, they are the oldest continuously operating. The parish has been operating on that spot since 1701. And now that spot happens to be right next to the Ambassador Bridge. And it's a pretty terrifying section of town. The last time I was over there, we got out with the guy I was with. I'm like, okay, lock the door, run inside. And that's an interesting one. If you want to see the most beautiful Catholic churches in the United States, you have to be willing to go to the most rotten neighborhoods. And there's a reason why, is because a lot of them were built by immigrants in our core cities, in the 1800s, or 1700s, 1800s, early 19th century, early 20th century. And a lot of times those areas in our major cities have become, bad areas. And there's the Ambassador Bridge right there. But this is an incredible building. And you can see, I like this shot because you can see so well with the roof line, the cruciform pattern. You see the 2 transepts named to that. And then it's kind of the neo-Gothic. It kind of wants to be neo-Gothic with the pointy windows. That's a really great view. So this would be the left transept. And here this rounded section would be the apse. So down here is the nave going to the front of the building. And then left transept sticking out, and then that rounded out. And then you can see the sort of neo-Gothic windows. And inside, that's what it looks like. And this is why, this is actually a picture from a wedding. I got their website. You can see it's very popular for weddings, and why that would be popular for weddings. But you see that neo-Gothic design, how beautiful that is, and all the light in there.
Mhm.
And this was built in 1886.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a prior building. This neo-Gothic construction was built in 18, but there was a building, they've been operating as a parish on that site, since 1701. And then here you can see in the apse, you can see their reredos right there. And then this would be, these little things here would be the choir up in the apse, in the presbytery.
We'll have to go back there.
You never.
Oh,
know.
yeah, I mean, it's just, they're always busy. Although I do know somebody who says he can get me in. Yeah, just a gorgeous church. You can see the rose window in the back.
Go to Bay City and you'll see one similar to that. It's a mini Notre Dame,
Oh, okay.
Saint Stanislaus,
Oh, nice.
Polish church,
Yeah.
very beautiful. Best
Well, let's
looking
think, so
church.
many of our immigrants they came from Europe and they built, or other places, and they built these beautiful churches. And that's the thing that gets me is you go to St. Adalbert, or you go to these were things built by the parishioners with their own hands. I mean, they worked all day in the furniture factory, and then they came over and they did tile work and they did plastering, and they did these kinds of things, and they're just remarkable. And it's terribly sad to see some of these buildings not cared for, which is why I mentioned last week, there's a whole market for a whole industry of where all these beautiful old churches are being torn down. People are taking the stained glass and the beautiful accoutrements and all that, and they're in warehouses. And so if you're remodeling your church, you could go get gorgeous Stations of the Cross or beautiful things from them. This one is in southern Illinois along the Mississippi River. So if you recall, we did an American Pilgrimages episode called Deep Woods and Great Lakes. We talked about how the French missionaries traveled along the rivers. So they traveled along the Mississippi River, whatever. That's why you see all these Catholic settlements. And this one was from later, but there's a lot of Catholic communities up and down the Mississippi. And this was an immigrant church there. And you can see this was really very much right on the prairie in southern Illinois there. Very much an American prairie mission in terms of what they had to work with in terms of materials, but you still see the transept. Yeah. And you still see even where they were basically building something out of, lumber and dotting and whatnot. They still were preserving those architectural elements. And this is the inside. You can see, even though it's, it's like a log cabin. Yeah, there's Mary and Joseph and these kinds of things. So even in a humble place like that, they were preserving those elements. Okay, a couple other things. The biggest Catholic churches in America. Okay, so I'm going to give you what should be an easy layup. What is the biggest Catholic church in the United States? Like physically largest?
The National Cathedral.
New York City.
No.
Washington,
D.C.
Yeah. The
Okay.
National Cathedral.
Yeah.
So the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception,
I've been there.
built in 1920, although they just a couple of years ago
Mhm.
finally finished this beautiful mosaic they have in the apse. But this is massive. It's not as big, it's nearly as big as St. Peter's, not as, but it's huge. And now, what architectural style?
It's like Romanesque.
Mhm.
Romanesque with some Byzantine elements. We didn't talk about Byzantine, but those are Eastern from the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Mediterranean, particularly the dome
Mhm.
has a sort of a Byzantine sort of dome to it. Well, what an incredibly beautiful church now. You can see the interior here, how massive it is.
Mhm.
And if I get lucky here. You can see just the scale of this thing. But do you also see the frescoes that are up in the domes? And the paintings. In fact, when you come up, this is the one that they just recently finished. This mosaic in the apse. Right? And so this is Christ Pantocrator, the judge. And as you worship, then you have apostles and saints. You can see Mary here with the 12 stars. And you can see various biblical scenes, but it goes back to that issue is when you were in the church, the environment, the liturgy taught, you learned, right? Because we learn by visual things, right? Not everybody is an auditory, whatever, the different kind of styles of learning, right? But we learn also through environment and space and visually, and these create that constant reminders of biblical truths and Catholic principles. And in a sense, every time you're sitting there, you're being catechized. Now, the second biggest Catholic church in America, almost just a notch smaller than this, like just by that much. You don't know. I guarantee you don't know, because it's just being finished right now, 2022. Open. I think it's going to open for worship in 2023.
Los Angeles?
Was it the Crystal Cathedral?
Don't get me started.
I know.
have all kinds of stories.
I know.
No, it is in Visalia, California. You know where Visalia is? Near Fresno, Central Valley. Yeah. This is St. Charles Borromeo Church in Visalia, California, being built, finished right now. It's going to be 3,200 seats. That makes it the largest parish church in America, because the Basilica of Immaculate Conception isn't really a parish church. This thing is massive. I think that the Basilica seats like 3,500 or 4,000 in Washington. This is just almost as big. So this is being done right now. And it's interesting architecturally. So you see the facade, what does that remind you of?
The mission.
The mission style, right?
Right.
And this is in California, right? It's in the Central Valley of California. So architecturally, with the facade, they wanted to have a connection, a narrative with the mission history, the Franciscan mission history of California, the Catholic Church there. But when you look at it from above, do you see that it's cruciform? And so these walls here, right? These like curtain walls or screen walls. If you took these little it's a cruciform church, but then they filled in those spaces for other purposes. So looking at it from above, it is a cruciform church. And they did put the seating in the transepts. Now, part of that is that in California, in order to build this thing, right? I mean, it's enormously expensive. They're trying to maximize the seating in there and minimize the environmental footprint, because I can't even imagine what it took to get this through, to get this built in California with all the things. And I read a couple of articles about it, and like the California state government just put them through all kinds of things about environmental things and heating and cooling and 10,000 other things. Yeah, the whole 9 yards. But you do see how they still managed to bring together, in a sense, two architecture styles: Spanish mission and a traditional cruciform church. And then you can see the little construction guys up there. are doing their construction stuff. Because this is still being finished. This is the mural. It's gonna be the apse. It's a beautiful, beautiful mural. It's massive, it's huge. That's right up in the apse there. And it shows various saints and the history of and it's some tie-ins to California missionaries. There's a pair of Sarahs in there and things like that. But you can see how they're tying in beautiful liturgical art. And this is a 3D render by the architects of what it'll look like when people are worshiping there. And you can see like Mary and Joseph in the niches there. Yay! And so what they've really done here, what they're going to do here, is they're bringing together some different kind of architectural styles, but preserving all the continuity of the tradition and whatnot. And I think this is absolutely remarkable.
It's nice to see a new church built like that.
Yeah,
And the boats were traditional, new architecture.
yeah,
So,
yeah. It's beautiful.
vision of the old.
On that mural,
Yeah.
was that more pastoral painting down below? Like, is that like the idea of the joining of?
I think it looks like California, like just the hills and the mountains, those are the Sierras and the. I
Yeah,
think-
but why would they put that there?
I don't see any wackos.
What's that?
I don't see any wackos.
No.
They're there.
To your point, Marilyn, I don't really know. I think if I had to guess,
Mm.
the architect is probably telling a story like this is California where we are, and then these are the saints in heaven over us, right? And so this is the bountiful land that we live in, and here's Junipero Serra, and here's the various missionaries, and here's all the people who are up in heaven in adoration for the
The idea that they still have a voice, those in.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
and they're advocating for us. Isn't that remarkable? And then just some other significant, beautiful ones that you probably know of. St. Patrick's in New York. How many people have been to it?
Mhm.
Yeah,
I've seen it.
yeah, pretty remarkable. Mid 1800s. What style is this? This is an easy question.
Gothic.
Gothic, yeah. This is a neo-Gothic construction. Very much so in the French style. You can see, now you see you don't have to have the flying buttresses because there's probably structure in there to hold it up. But inside it looks like Sharp Cathedral or those other ones thing. And so you can see that it creates those vaulted spaces. And St. Patrick's is absolutely beautiful. Really beautiful church.
What form of architecture would you call Sagrada Familia?
It's its own thing, man. It has Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is, I mean, it's almost like he
It's got
intentionally,
everything.
yeah, it's almost like he intentionally is
Not done yet.
borrowing things from all the traditions. So it's got Gothic elements because it's got like pointy spires, but then it has rounded elements, and I mean, he really just was kind of creating something that I think is beautiful. It's crazy. It's sort of crazy, but it's like he just was going to borrow, from everything in the tradition he could and kind of bring it all together. Sagrada Familia is unlike anything else. Like you go to it and you just go, yeah, there's nothing like this. I don't know.
I've been told it will never be a family parish.
Right.
It makes too much money.
Yeah, it's a tourist thing, but it's a remarkable place. So St. Patrick's, a couple other ones. Again, St. Patrick's Rose Window. St. Louis, Missouri, where our own Audrey Thomas was from, played the organ in this church, I think. This is a really remarkable. Now, again, what style?
Romanesque.
Romanesque. Yeah, it's kind of actually, yeah, it's a Romanesque style. Actually,
Some color.
northern France called a Norman, from Normandy, France, kind of a version of the Romanesque. And then inside, this is very Romanesque with some Byzantine elements.
Mhm.
And you can see the rounded arches and then the beautiful frescoes and the adornment inside. And I think this next picture, yes, the lighting has been corrected or the color's been corrected, and you can actually, that's all the art that's in there. That's what the walls look like. It's absolutely stunning. And so everywhere you go, you're seeing scenes from scripture, you're seeing scenes from church history, you're seeing doctrines illustrated. And it constantly just sort of teaches you and inspires you. It's just absolutely incredible. And the level of detail to just see even the kind of floral patterns, they're everywhere you look at something beautiful. Because it's making a statement that God is, the source of truth, goodness, and beauty. And when we build these modern church buildings that are just sort of brutalist and bare and modernistic, what do we say? These said God is the source of truth, goodness, and beauty. This is from 2 Timothy 4, where Paul says, I have run the race and I have fought the fight, and now they're stored up for me. And this is a wonderful kind of mosaic in there, that sort of Byzantine style, where he says, I've kept the faith, I've fought the fight, the good fight. And so, the reason I included this one is that as you sit in this church, and you're surrounded by all this kind of thing, it reminds you of biblical passages. So when you look at this, you remember Paul, 2 Timothy 4:17, and you think of the story of St. Paul, and you're reminded of all of these things constantly filling your senses.
And it develops a sacred place.
Yeah, it's a very sacred place. And then these are just some like random examples, because you can go to every city in America and find these beautiful immigrant churches. St. Mary the Angels in Chicago, 1899. That was when, Mother Cabrini and all the rest of them were coming here. They're building beautiful churches with their hands. These were poor immigrants who were day laborers, and they gave what they had and they labored with their hands, and they built these. Every city in America has Catholic churches like this, and often these immigrant churches are in bad parts of town now because of the way our cities have degraded. Now, Jerry DeShaw was telling me last week afterwards, I've not been here. I've been to Minneapolis, St. Paul a couple times, many times actually, but I never went to this because I wasn't Catholic at the time. But he said he and Julie were here recently, and he said this was remarkable. One of the most beautiful Catholic churches you see in the entire United States, in St. Paul, and just absolutely stunning. And then Newark, New Jersey. For a few of you will know that in the TV show The Sopranos, at the beginning of the opening song, Tony Soprano would drive past this in his Suburban. I was told that. But it's right there in Newark, in a crummy part of Newark, which is why I think they show Tony Soprano driving around in it. But these beautiful immigrant churches were built, in those eras.
Built by the Corleones.
Yeah. And then close down. There's our very own basilica, built by Polish immigrants. Right at I think they started it in 1908 or 1907, and then it took them, I think, till 1913 to finish it. It's absolutely gorgeous. But tell me what style you see here? The Romanesque, right? You see those kind of Romanesque rounded arches and square things. And then when you come inside, you see again these very beautiful elements. You see the umbrella, indicating a minor basilica. See the apse. And then I want to point out another thing they have here. Okay, you see the Mary and the Joseph statues, sides of the church. But then also, you see what's over the altar? That canopy thing, the tower.
That's super cool.
That's in a lot of the, like for example, in St. Peter's, there's a giant canopy that's over the altar. It's called a baldachin or baldacchino. Take it with me, baldacchino. Not cappuccino. It's a baldacchino, baldachin. And it's kind of a canopy that's built over it. And the biblical reference to it is a reference to the tabernacle or the temple in the Old Testament, right? So here's the altar of sacrifice and the holy space that's covered by. So it's almost like a representation of that tent, that temple that covers that most holy space of the altar. And you see it in St. Peter's, and you see it in a lot of the churches in Italy, a baldachin or baldacchino. And when you're talking to John Jamie, the architects, they've done several of these baldaccinos in some of the churches in Grand Rapids that are being redone, where they say, hey, we're kind of modernist and we want to do something with, and we put the tabernacle, and they've done, you know, kind of a smaller version of something that sits over the tabernacle and designates it, makes it kind of a beautiful space. So, and again, you can see here, this is just right, you can go over to Grand Rapids and go to Massey. And you can see, how many of you have been there? Oh, been there. You need to go over and go to Massey. It's just an incredibly beautiful building. And you know, when you look up into those, what are they called? Oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my final Jeopardy. The little spaces up there where the angels are. There's a word for where those arches come together in that little space, and like in Trivial Pursuit, but it's that little space between them. But you see the angels, and so as you sit up there, you see cherubim and seraphim looking down on you. And again, the space is constantly catechizing. Your faith is being, our faith is being incarnated and expressed in the space, and the liturgy is being celebrated in that. As we said last week when we saw in Revelation 5, you know, it comes from us from the throne room of God.
Comment about, they do a Sunday TV match here. They've been doing it for, I don't know, 40 years.
Basilica?
Yes, and it's on Sunday morning on commercial television,
They
the
do.
local Fox station.
I've seen the one from the
Cathedral.
But this is the Basilica
That's the basilica.
Oh, wasn't this?
on the other side.
It looks, you probably are just thinking it looks similar.
This is
Okay.
196.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you see it on the other side of the river, right over there.
Okay, I've got the wrong church. I gotta.
Yeah, no,
you're
this
thinking
is,
the cathedral.
When you're going
You're
westbound.
So you see the freeway.
Yes, I know, yeah.
Yeah, and so as you go in there now, the cathedral's on the
Other side.
other side,
More-
and then this is up here on the west side, just north of 96, and then 31 is there. So whenever you're making that bend, you see the domes sitting up there like the bronze
I
dome.
thought it looked a little strange. All I was picking up on was the
Yeah.
Andrew, no, it's not Andrew.
You got one of the A churches.
Okay, what's the significance of the stripes and the columns? For instance,
So part of it is just ancient design, but there is I think there is a thing about, they believe that the columns in the temple, Solomon's temple, were carved and striped. How many of you have seen the baldacchino over in you pull it real quick here. Let's see, there we go. St. Peter's Basilica altar. So this. Okay, how many of you seen, right?
Yes.
So this was a design by an artist named Johnny Bernini. Now you notice that and by the way, this is insanely big. It's like 80 feet tall. Like this isn't the scale. It's like it's like 60 or 80 feet.
See the little person there?
Yeah, the little person there, but that even is like there's foreshortening going on.
pardon, where is this?
This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
Okay, all right.
Now, do you see the columns though? The columns are corkscrewy. So they asked Bernini why he designed corkscrewy columns. And the thing is that there was, whether it's true or not, the belief at that time architecturally was that the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon built, the columns had helixes, spiraling, had helixes on them. And so Bernini wanted it to look like the Temple of Solomon and tried to draw that element in. In fact, I think, as I mentioned last week, in the Vatican, in the Sistine Chapel, when you go in there with Michelangelo's frescoes, the Sistine Chapel was designed to be the exact dimensions of Solomon's temple. Because it does say in the Bible, so many cubits by so many cubits by so many cubits. And so when the Pope Pope Sixtus the 10th or whatever it was laid it out. He said, it's got to be the exact proportions of the temple. So you go in there and it's like, well, so yeah, part of that is, my point being, is that you're always trying to draw elements from scripture and tradition and incorporate these things. And again, like we saw in Revelation 5 last week with John, what we're trying to do is enter into, participate in the eternal liturgy. And to the extent that this space allows us to do that. Now, our modernist spaces, this is the logic, and I shared with you last week a little bit of my story of having worked in and out of on and off with church architects for almost 10 years in various capacities. You know, in the evangelical world, what we talked about all the time is that the church is basically an auditorium. We're designing it for sight lines and traffic patterns and for acoustics. And the important thing is that we create a place where people can see and hear the show, in essence. So why do you make it in the round? With two reasons for it to be in the round. One is that everybody can have a good view, because it's important everybody get to see. And the other thing is when you're sitting in the round, you can look across and see everybody else and go, hey, this is great. Look at, we can all see each other, and it was emphasizing that immanence and community. And so again, the forms get, and then when you start saying, well, let's start thinking about acoustics and sight lines and comfort and how are people going to sit and what's the ingress and egress patterns. And so what you do is you begin by asking a very different set of questions. The point I've been trying to make last week and tonight is that traditionally Catholic churches were designed to replicate or bring forth biblical principles and truths, to be continuous with that. But if the starting point of your question is how do we design basically a performing arts center? Is it right? And you've already made a strategic decision about what you think is important. And that it's a performance that people want to see and hear and be comfortable at. So again, you know, that's not an argument that everybody should be uncomfortable or not be able to see or hear, but it's an argument that you're starting wherever you start, what your assumptions are and your goals are going to lead to something. And, you know, we, in many ways, in the last 50, 60 years, not just in the Catholic Church, but in Protestant churches, started to build churches that were essentially designed to be auditoriums. And the art was stripped out. It was value engineered away because you'd sit there and say, hey, look, you know, it's important to put the air conditioning and the air handlers in, and we do this and we do that. And you go, is there any money left over for a Mary and Joseph statue? No, maybe we can get that later. The important thing is we've got a comfortable place for people to sit and stand and go to the bathroom. And you go, yeah, but why can't we have a Mary and Joseph statue? Well, that's the important thing is we had, you know, enough bathrooms and enough sight lines and enough this and that. And so again, I mean, I'm not trying to throw stones. I'm just saying when you start with that as your starting place, you know, that's what you end up with. And traditionally church architecture, United States, whatever, has been, as Catholics, how do we look into scripture, look into tradition, look into the teachings of the church, look into our history, the democracy that, and then bring that forward into our community. And there are going to be adaptations. Like we saw, the Spanish mission is sort of an adaptation of those principles to a new reality. And so it is possible. You don't have to, you know, keep building Sharp Cathedral over and over again. But when you cut that off, you end up with something's cut off. Yeah.
Have you been to the cathedral in Iredale?
No.
In Mother Angelica?
Oh, is that down in Alabama?
Yes, yeah.
No, we've been talking for a long time about taking a lane.
That's a very, very interesting structure. I mean, it's beautiful, but the apse there contains the cloistered nuns that are praying 24 hours. You can hear them praying all the time. And they actually have a little place they draw their curtains sort of back so they can attend mass, but still stay cloistered. I mean, it's a beautiful place, and then you can visit the chapel that you see on EWTN's mass every day.
So Carla, we've been talking for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
COVID, all that.
I mean, it's a day,
lane trip
there.
Yeah.
Because there's two chapels, and then there's the building, the barn that she lived in while it was being built. And that was basically, she begged money from
Oh, yeah.
the retired mafia in Florida. to
Her-
build it.
Her, I
She was
love her
originally from
story.
Canton, Ohio.
Yeah.
Right down the street from me.
I love her
Rossborn.
story. Mother Angelica's
It's a
wonderful
wonderful
biography. She's my hero. She's awesome.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we hope to do some kind of a lane trip down there because there's some things to stop and see along the way and all of
We've been
that.
starting that.
So other questions or thoughts or comments? I'm done with my part, and then next week we're gonna have John and Jamie. And like I said, my plea to all of you is, you know, come on, a little pride for Our Lady of the Lake. Let's not show up to an empty room, right? We got some pretty special guests. They're gonna come and talk about canon law, Vatican II, what is the Roman Missal, what is required in a church, what is not required, how do you design it? And so there's gonna be some really good insights into that. And then the following week, like I said, we're gonna go on a field trip and see what they're doing at St. Robert's, because St. Robert's is doing this, this whole, you know, revival thing that they're building. And then St. Mary Magdalene in Wyoming and Kentwood are, that church actually burned down.
Yeah.
And so then they rebuilt it, and they've been, Progressive A's been rebuilding it, and so really cool stuff. All right. Questions, comments? Otherwise, I'll stick around for a little bit if you want to talk. And thanks for coming.
Good job.